Moloch, sometimes pronounced as Molech, is a name that appears several times in the Hebrew Bible, primarily in Leviticus, but also showing up in the Book of Kings 1 and 2, and also in Jeremiah. Usually, if we look across different translations of the Bible, we are able to find slightly different sentiments about characters, perhaps infer slightly different connotations depending on the author's fancy. But with Moloch, wherever he appears and in whatever translation, the accounts are unanimous. Moloch is condemned in the strongest of terms. He is warned against as being the most wicked entity. He is clearly defined as being the most detestable, and the rituals linked to him, most chillingly child sacrifice, are treated as abominations. In today's episode, we'll be tracking down every mention of Moloch across scripture and understanding just how dark and bleak this ancient deity was, that he was able to manipulate the ancient Israelites into tossing their children into the fires to please him. Leviticus 18 is a chapter focused on forbidden sexual practices, setting out a strict moral code that defines what is considered unacceptable behavior among the Israelites. It draws a hard line between what is holy and what is corrupt, listing incestuous relationships, adultery, and at one point, even the condemnation of this Moloch and the sacrifices that are so ingrained with his reputation. We are told, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God." This is the first time Moloch is mentioned in the Bible, and as we can see, he is mentioned almost casually, without any introduction and without much in the way of context. In a sense, the narrator, or God, assumes the reader knows who Moloch is, perhaps an indication of how sinister and notorious he is, that he requires no explanation. The people of that time would have known Moloch all too well, the pagan god of the Ammonites, a group of people who had descended from Lot, and despite such descendancy, would find themselves clashing frequently with the Israelites, being noteworthy for their hostility. These Ammonites, amongst the many other groups living in Canaan at that time, were, as far as the Bible tells us, a wicked people, for they chose not to worship the biblical God and chose instead to worship their own false gods. These people, as a result of their godlessness, were believed to engage in the more sinful practices of adultery, warfare, incest, and of course, child sacrifice, something their god Moloch demanded. It makes sense then why this offering of children to Moloch in Leviticus is not further elaborated on either, but rather assumed from the vagueness of the line that this was a practice that was commonly known to an ancient audience, and that this was something that the intended audience already knew was pretty heinous. In any case, the verse here is pretty clear. It was a warning to the Israelites not to give their children to the Canaanites. Regardless of how they came across, these were not a people to be trusted, and their god's diabolical appetite was not something to entertain. In another interpretation of this verse, some point to how it sits almost misplaced amongst the other warnings in the passage, those which, as aforementioned, focus on a more sexual aspect. Here, readers are encouraged not to attempt to have sex with women whilst they're menstruating, not to lie with their neighbour's wife, not to engage in homosexuality, and not to lie with animals. In between all of this is Moloch. So why does Moloch and child sacrifice get brought up here, in a passage seemingly dedicated to perversions and sexual deviancy? To some scholars, the placement of Moloch here reflects a Jewish tradition that those who offered up their daughters to Moloch were not literally offering their lives, but rather committing their daughters to live as temple prostitutes, in exchange for blessings and boons that were believed to have been grantable by Moloch alone. Yet the general consensus is that these verses containing Moloch do indeed refer to actual human sacrifices, particularly infanticide, which brings up another idea, that those who were bringing children to Moloch were not always of Ammonite descent, nor of even the surrounding Canaanite areas, but were also Israelites who had found Moloch and his method of worship to be a convenient way to get rid of children that were born out of wedlock. For these people, Not only did it destroy the evidence of an affair from the community, but it also could be seen as hiding it from God, almost as if removing the product of the affair from existence was enough to vindicate them of having sinned at all. This loophole, if you will, is perhaps why God speaks to Moses in Leviticus so plainly, because he means to set the record straight about Moloch and remind his people that engaging in this activity will not absolve them. In fact, it lands them in even more trouble. Chapter 20 of Leviticus expands on chapter 18. Where chapter 18 told us what not to do, chapter 20 tells us what would happen if we did it anyway. It comes across as a list of punishments, mostly consequences for sexual immorality, but once again featuring the likes of Moloch here. As you can imagine, the punishment for engaging with Moloch and giving away one's children to him is most severe indeed. We are told, any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Moloch is put to death. The members of the community are to stone him. I myself will set my face against him and will cut him off from his people, for by sacrificing his children to Moloch, he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. If the members of the community close their eyes when that man sacrifices one of his children to Moloch, and if they fail to put him to death, I myself will set my face against him and his family, and will cut them off from their people together with all who follow him in prostituting themselves to Moloch. This puts into perspective just how vilified Moloch was, and perhaps just how much God despised this other dark entity. It wasn't just the Israelites, God's chosen people, who would bear the brunt of the consequences should they partake in the rituals, but also anyone who was living within Israel who did so too. Now, we know that all people were God's people, according to the biblical narrative, even if they didn't acknowledge it themselves. But it's interesting that God is willing to go out of his way here to set the punishment for anyone, even those who weren't really bothering him or the Israelites, if they went and paid tribute to Moloch. What's more interesting is that despite having the power to punish people himself, he leaves this matter in the hands of the community to fulfill. Those found to be guilty of entertaining Moloch and engaging in child sacrifice were to be stoned to death, which also gives us the impression that this wasn't just a transgression against God, but a transgression against the community itself. Sacrificing children was just as much a horror to us today as it was to the ancient Israelites. Perhaps even the Ammonites themselves had their reservations about it. But the main takeaway here is that this passage of Leviticus shows us the mood and sentiments behind the original authors when it came to Moloch and child sacrifice. Additionally, you'll notice that it isn't enough for God to lay down these rules and punishments, for he probably knew that despite the severity of his words, they would not be fulfilled in their entirety unless there was an even greater incentive. The old adage, evil presides when good men do nothing, comes to mind, and this is what the biblical God was basically guarding against. He wanted to encourage the community to work together and hold evil accountable, even if it might have been uncomfortable to do so, and even if they had to end up stoning someone they actually liked. No one was allowed to breach this standard set by God, and if they did, well then the Israelites now had an obligation to rectify the behavior, and further discourage anyone else from trying it in the future. He warned the Israelites that if they turned a blind eye to what was happening and did not punish offenders, then he would make the punishment even worse for the offender. He would set his face against the offender and his family, which in effect might have put some unwitting bystanders in the crosshairs too, for being guilty by mere association. You might say that God was encouraging the Israelites to show mercy here, give the man a quick death by stoning, rather than let him and his family suffer at the hands of God. But it might also be said that this was the perfect leverage by God to ensure that man did what he had instructed. No one wanted to be the brother or sister of the man who sacrificed his children, right? Because then it also made them eligible for being cut off from their people if they didn't participate or instigate the stoning. By chapter 11 of the first book of Kings, we are well into the reign of King Solomon. In fact, some might say that by this stage, we are entering the downfall of Solomon. Indeed, despite his initial wisdom and God's favour, it is Solomon's love for women and his inability to resist their charms and allures that lead him off the righteous path. Indeed, the Bible tells us that God was very clear when it came to the Canaanites, and that no one ought to have married their women, for they would turn the hearts of their men over to their gods and ultimately corrupt them. Unfortunately, Solomon could not resist. We know he had hundreds of wives and concubines who did in fact turn his heart after other gods, and we know he built many temples and altars to service these gods, proving that he was no longer completely true to the Lord. In this section of the Bible, we are told Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Whilst we know all the pagan Canaanite gods were wicked as far as the Bible is concerned, it is interesting that when Ashtoreth is mentioned, she is merely stated without judgment, but when Moloch is mentioned, he is defined as detestable. The original authors of the text can't help but reveal their disdain of this entity, which, going back to Leviticus, is evident by just how far God is willing to go to stop people from engaging with him. Moloch isn't just a taboo, no, he's an outright anathema to the ancient audience. However, in the same chapter, Chemosh, the pagan god of the Moabites, is also described as detestable, which in a way does sort of subtract from the malevolence of Moloch. I mean, if suddenly other pagan gods are detestable, it sort of gives the impression that the original authors were just using that label arbitrarily to diminish the deities that didn't fit within their own doctrine, not because they were actually detestable. On the other hand, perhaps this Chemosh was just as bad as Moloch, thus earning the adjective detestable as well. In any case, we see Moloch mentioned again here in conjunction with Chemosh. We are told, on a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. What's interesting here is that by the law set down by God in Leviticus, Solomon ought to have been stoned to death by the community for his worshipping of Moloch. Indeed, whilst we don't see Solomon actually make any sacrifices unto the deity, it does seem like he's waded more than waist deep into the waters of sin with this one, and probably did warrant that very same punishment from Leviticus. In the second book of Kings, chapter 23, we see Josiah begin to make religious reforms in Judah and the former king of Israel, where some of his main efforts include purging the idolatry that had become commonplace. Here we see Josiah remove and destroy certain idolatrous places, objects, altars, etc., those that were dedicated to foreign gods, most notably Moloch. We are told Josiah desecrated Topheth, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so no one could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire to Molech. Evidently, Josiah did not suffer from the same temptations as Solomon, and instead of creating these temples and monuments to the other gods, went about destroying them instead. Indeed, here we essentially see the end of Moloch, who was no longer worshipped after this time because Josiah saw to it that this area of Topheth, in the valley of Ben Hinnom, where most of the sacred rites to Moloch would take place, was defiled, left in ruins. In some interpretations, this valley, sometimes referred to as Gehenna, was also believed to be a place where perpetual fires were kept ablaze in order to consume all the filth and waste of the city. In these interpretations, this Gehenna could also be seen as a type of hell, the perpetual inferno giving rise to similar imagery of what we might expect of hell. In another Jewish legend, Topheth was named with the Toph drum in mind, because instruments of this kind were believed to have been beaten to drown out the cries of children who were thrown into the fire to be sacrificed. In this part of the chapter, the natures of Solomon's gods are also further confirmed as being malignant and baleful, for we are told that Ashtoreth was actually vile, Chemosh also, and that Molech was once again detestable. Josiah desecrated the high places that were east of Jerusalem, on the south of the hill of corruption, the one Solomon, king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the vile goddess of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the vile god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the people of Ammon. Jeremiah 32 sees the final mention of Moloch in the entire Bible, though perhaps retrospectively. By this point, at least 2 decades were believed to have passed since Josiah had destroyed the ritual site for Moloch, and essentially put an end to the child sacrifices that were taking place. Of course, it can be argued that these sorts of tributes to Moloch continue to happen in secret, or in other areas in and around Jerusalem, which is why God is seen to be so angry here. Chapter 32 of Jeremiah tells us that Jeremiah purchases a field in Anathoth during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, an event orchestrated by a vengeful God who deliberately delivered the people of Jerusalem and Judah into the hands of the invaders. We see God tell Judah his exact intentions here, that the Babylonians will set fire to the city, will burn it down along with all the houses, because the people there, his own people, had aroused his anger by burning incense on the roofs to Baal and pouring out drink offerings to other gods. Evidently, despite Josiah's efforts to destroy the altars and monuments to the pagan deities, the worship of them still continued, leading us to believe that Moloch worship and the associated child sacrifices were still taking place in some capacity. The people of Israel and Judah have done nothing but evil in my sight from their youth. Indeed, the people of Israel have done nothing but arouse my anger with what their hands have made, declared the Lord. God's words to Jeremiah here are pretty scathing. He speaks in depth over a few lines about how disappointed he is with his chosen people, mentioning how they have provoked him. Not just the everyday man, but the officials, the priests, even their kings. Looking at you, Solomon, they turned their backs to me, God laments, showing us just how hurt and scorned he was by the very people he had delivered unto the promised land. What's worse is he then proceeds to tell Jeremiah that it's bad enough they rejected him, but they went ahead and worshipped other deities. They set up their vile images in the house that bears my name and defiled it. They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Molech, though I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind, that they should do such a detestable thing. It is possible that God was still reeling from the depravity during Josiah's time, and that this is what he is referring to. Notice that God speaks of these events in the past tense, giving us the idea that whilst these things had stopped happening thanks to Josiah, they were still nonetheless living rent-free in God's head, and still a relatively recent sore spot for him. Remember, only around 20 years had passed between the time of Josiah and Jeremiah, which if you think about in terms of one who created the universe, 20 years is probably nothing. Lastly, the shock we can infer from God's tone when he mentioned Moloch and the child sacrifices speaks volumes. Though I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind, that they should do such a detestable thing. Indeed, even God, the Creator, cannot believe the wickedness of Moloch, and can't quite seem to digest how his chosen people had even been roped into it. So evil was such a practice. It didn't even enter his mind. He who knew everything and was aware of all things did not have the capacity to conceive something as vile as ritualistic child sacrifice, which once more has the effect of demonstrating the extreme contrast between a deity like Moloch and a deity like the biblical God. In a way, it's almost as if God is drawing a line between himself and such a deity. Indeed, he might vaporize a couple of cities, send an angel of death to spread disease, and plague a land with famine, but child sacrifice, that was a step too far. Whilst the Bible is uncharacteristically detailed about who Moloch was and how one might have worshipped him, we can't help but wonder about some of the glaring admissions about such a dark and gruesome character. One of the most chilling factors stems from what the Bible doesn't tell us about Moloch, what he looks like. Indeed, many will be familiar with the image of Moloch that I've used throughout this episode, a bull-headed humanoid figure whose arms are outstretched. Yet it should be noted that the Bible never describes him in this way, or in any other way. In fact, actual images of Moloch didn't seem to enter the limelight until around the 18th and 19th century, when demonology and the fascination with the occult began to see a resurgence. The imagery of Moloch is usually depicted with an elaborate statue, with several open compartments embedded on its torso and filled with flames, representing individual furnaces or offering platforms where infants were possibly placed. Now, this might sound like an artistic portrayal that takes a lot of liberties, if based off of the biblical account, but if we look to actual historical accounts, such an elaborate and eerie construction as this might not have been out of the realm of possibility. One idea goes hand in hand with our earlier discussed point, that whilst Josiah dealt a significant blow to the worshipping of Moloch, he failed to eradicate Moloch in the long term, which saw the deity eventually return, leading to Israel and Judah being conquered by Babylon. Yet it is also believed that Moloch survived even this, making his way into Carthage, where he was rebranded as Cronus, the same Cronus who devoured his own children in Greek mythology. The belief is that Moloch, now Cronus, became something of a popular deity for the Carthaginians, and that giant statues made of bronze were erected of him, and then heated up so as to scorch children to death. But don't take my word for it. In a commentary of Plato's Republic by 4th century historian Cleitarchus, we are told that there was a large bronze statue of this Cronus in Carthage that stood with its hands extended over a bronze brazier, the flames of which engulf the child. When the flames fall upon the body, the limbs contract and the open mouth seems almost to be laughing until the contracted body slips quietly into the brazier. Thus it is that the grin is known as sardonic laughter, since they die laughing. Ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus adds to this in his Library of History, telling us, "There was in their city a bronze image of Cronus extending its hands, palms up and sloping towards the ground, so that each of the children, when placed thereon, rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire." Yet another account from Plutarch in his work on superstition, we are told that those who sacrificed their children to this deity did so willingly and with the full awareness of the horror of what they were doing. But with full knowledge and understanding, they themselves offered up their own children, and those who had no children would buy little ones from poor people and cut their throats as if they were so many lambs or young birds. Meanwhile, the mother stood by without tear or moan, but should she utter a single moan or let fall a single tear, she had to forfeit the money, and her child was sacrificed nevertheless, and the whole area before the statue was filled with a loud noise of flutes and drums, that the cries of wailing should not reach the ears of the people. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to like and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss my next upload. Until next time.